Thank you, Evan. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's GLR Week session, The Influence of Social Emotional Learning, Closing Literacy Gaps in the Classroom. SEL aims to become a significant focus in education, and it aims to equip students with skills such as self-awareness, emotional regulation, empathy, and interpersonal competencies. Proponents lift up SEL as enhancing academic performance and fostering a positive school climate, reducing behavioral issues, and preparing students for success in life beyond the classroom. Advocates of SEL emphasize it aims to create well-rounded individuals who can navigate the educational landscape with resilience and empathy. That said, SEL is not without its critics and challenges. Key concerns include the potential for ideological bias, the infringement on parental rights, and the diversion of time and resources away from traditional academic subjects. Today, in the first of 3 webinars in CGLR's SEL mini-series, we will hear the case for why and how SEL would make a positive contribution to young children's educational journey. Our experts here today are trying to speak to why SEL is pivotal. With that, I'm excited to introduce our panel for today's conversation. Please note that I am just previewing who we have here with us today, and full bios will be linked in the chat. Christina Cipriano is an associate professor at the Yale Child Study Center and the director of the Education Collaboratory at Yale. Dr. Cipriano is an applied developmental and educational psychologist, and her research focuses on social and emotional learning intervention and assessment in the service of marginalized student and teacher populations through systematic examination of the interactions within their homes, schools, and communities to promote pathways to optimal developmental outcomes. Chris is a national expert in SEL and has extensive experience working in classrooms with marginalized populations. Carol D. Lee is a professor emerita at education in the School of Education at Social Policy and in African American Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Lee is the president of the National Academy of Education, which is best known in academia for her 5 decades of work, helping students from minority backgrounds excel in an environment of low expectations, poverty, negative stereotypes, and other barriers. She was among the early scholars to scaffold children's everyday experiences as a resource for learning in school. Today, her sophisticated ideas behind cultural modeling are a standard approach in the field. And Lakeisha Steele is CASEL's Vice President of Policy. Before joining CASEL, Lakeisha served in the Biden-Harris administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Legislation and Congressional Affairs at the Department of Education. Prior to her service in the Biden-Harris administration, Lakeisha served 8 years on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives, most recently as Senior Education Policy Advisor on the House Education and Labor Committee, where she led K-12 education policy. And our moderator for today's conversation, Natalie Walrand. Natalie serves as Senior Managing Director, Whole Person, Family, and Community Systems for the Early Learning, Health, and Human Development Division at West Ed. In this role, she partners with 2 other Senior Managing Directors to oversee quality, impact, talent development, and business development for the division. Natalie brings to her work 30 years of experience in K-12 education, finance, and strategy, working with both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. Walrand speaks and writes on social media and on social and emotional well-being, system alignment and coherence, academic excellence, and equity. Natalie also serves as the Associate Director of the Region 15 Comprehensive Center at West Ed, overseeing the focus area leads, the equity lead, and the center's visibility and eminence building efforts. Natalie, with that, I am excited to turn it over to you to moderate and kick off our conversation. But I will ask that before you get into your moderating role, I was wondering if it would be possible for you to provide with us a little bit of background. Before you dive in, would you mind spending a few minutes sharing some background on your work and what brought you here today?
Oh, I'm happy to do so. Thank you so much, Sierra. Hi, everybody. I will say I'm so delighted to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me. I want to share that in the prep calls we had for this webinar, we had a really rich and lively conversation about the research, policy, and practice at the nexus of language and literacy, social and emotional learning, and equity. You will hear today that this is something that we are all very passionate about it, and our work together has intersected in some really beautiful ways. So I'll respond to Sierra's question. As Sierra mentioned, I was the director of the federally funded Center to Improve Social and Emotional Learning and School Safety at WestEd. And that center was funded out of the Office of Safe and Supportive Schools and charged with building the knowledge and capacity of state, regional, and local education system leaders for implementing evidence-based, equity-centered, and sustainable practice and policy related to social and emotional learning. So during the life of the center, we developed a variety of evidence-based tools and resources related to SEL under 5 big themes: equity, integration of SEL with other whole person initiatives and academic practices, alignment and coherence of whole person work, sustainable implementation, and data-driven cycles of improvement. We also led several peer collaboratives, including 3 that served 25 states in total. And there was one collaborative called Transforming Kindergarten that served 15 states, where we had some really wonderful opportunities to work together with the campaign and with New America. And then, of course, the center provided direct technical assistance to SEAs and LEAs. So that's me and what brings me here. And before we kick off, I want to share just a few slides, and I'll try to be quick about it. So as you listen to the wisdom of these 3 awesome panelists, there's going to be some themes that you hear, and we wanted to make sure that you noticed them as we go through the conversation. So the webinar is really going to be focusing on how we can align like the research, the policy, and the practice toward this coherent vision of integrating social and emotional well-being with language acquisition and literacy. So the 3 ideas are first around the science of learning and development, which guides us to focus on relationships and environments as foundational to learning at high levels. So it's less about the evidence-based program you might select or the framework you might follow, and more about the conditions for learning and development that you create for learners. The second idea is about integrating social and emotional well-being and equity with literacy instruction, and that it benefits all students, and it can be contextualized for the background, identity, and circumstances of the learning community that you might serve. So by centering social and emotional well-being and the multiple identities of the students, families, and communities that you serve, students benefit from a fuller, richer understanding of self, of others, of community, of society, and that promotes self-worth as well as empathy. And then the final big idea is that literacy is essential to learning across all disciplines. So when you hear us talk about literacy, it's not just about English language arts. It's essential to critical thinking, engaging in complex concepts, scientific inquiries. So the idea of literacy actually connects to all different curricular areas. Okay, so equity-centered SEL. So one thing that I will share as you're looking at this slide is that people use this term SEL in multiple different ways. Some people mean a curriculum, some people mean a practice. There are hundreds of different constructs that people draw from. People sometimes conflate the term with other bodies of work like mental health, for example. And so the definition of SEL has been evolving over the last 30 years, and research and capacity building agencies have been continuing to pull together the evidence base behind SEL to get like more and more tight and succinct about what we mean by this term. And so the definition here is from Rob Jagers at Castle. He has been doing a lot of research and writing that more explicitly grounds SEL in equity. And I'm not going to read this. I know there's a lot of text here, but I love this language because of all of the important concepts that are crammed into these paragraphs, right? So when you have the chance to, after this webinar, slow down and read the slides, you'll see ideas that are included here around SEL being an integral part of education and human development. Integral, interwoven with, right? It includes concepts around authentic school, family, and community partnerships, the emphasis on learning environments and experiences, the emphasis on relationships, with rigorous and meaningful curriculum instruction and ongoing evaluation, and the idea of co-creating thriving schools. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So it's important to remember that social and emotional learning is in fact evidence-based practice, right? And it's grounded in the science of learning and development. So I want to share a little bit about this. So people abbreviate science of learning and development as SOLD. And SOLD is a synthesis of a body of research, science, and other evidence from a variety of scientific disciplines about how human beings learn and learn and develop. And so for the purposes of this webinar, these are the two big ideas that I want us to focus on. The first is that learning is integrated, and the second is that learning is contextual. So here's what I mean by those pieces. So learning is integrated. Actually, can you go back to the previous slide? Previous slide. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. So research and science describe learning and development as happening along 4 domains. So it's social, emotional, cognitive, and physiological. And then in the early childhood education space, sometimes research will add a 5th domain around language acquisition. And these domains, what's important to know is that they develop in integrated ways. So strength in one domain actually bolsters the others, and struggles in one domain actually can be limiting to the others. So this is what people mean when they talk about whole person education. It's about knowing that in order to support each learner so that they reach their fullest potential, we have to attend to all of those domains together, right? The second idea is learning is contextual. And so SOLD also reminds us about how brain development happens. So learning and development involves a continuous interactive process of experimentation and science and trial and error between a human being and their environment. So learning happens when we're testing new ideas and we're making connections, and that actually forms and reinforces the neural connections and pathways in our brain. So ultimately, what science is telling us is that our brain synapses and ultimately our brain structure is formed through our experiences. And what this means for education is that when we attend to the quality of relationships and environments that we provide for our learners, that's a significant factor in their ability to learn. That attends to the whole person. All right, so in the interest of time, maybe let's go to the next slide. What you'll hear us all talking about today is about ecological approaches. So the science of learning and development promotes this approach that is about the conditions for young people and the adults who care for them that they need to teach, learn, and thrive, right? And that by taking this ecological approach, we are ensuring that we're not blaming an individual or a community, but actually focusing on the conditions that we're creating. And there's this quote that I love from Thich Nhat Hanh, who says, when you are planting lettuce, if it doesn't grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for the reasons that it's not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun, but you never blame the lettuce, right? Okay, so now I'm ready for the next slide. Let's move to literacy. So I was thinking about Goldie Muhammad. She argues for a reframed approach that centers identity and equity learning in literacy and language classrooms. And she's got this beautiful quote here that actually came up in another campaign webinar, a campaign for grade level reading webinar about a year ago. And one of the things that she says in her writing is, youth who do not know who they are, including the truth of their histories, risk passively believing anything about their identities. They need to have a strong sense of self to navigate their society. Language arts can be a useful learning space where students can engage in literacy practices to make sense of their own lives and the lives of others, to learn about issues of power, equity, and anti-oppression. What's more, integrating issues of identity and equity into lessons can make learning more relevant and engaging for students. So what you're going to hear about today is another white paper that CASEL has prepared that really underscores this idea. And I am going to now turn to our panelists. All right, Chris, I'm going to turn to you. I'm hoping you can start us off. So you and I met years ago. I have been always so excited about the research that you are coming out with that is at the nexus of SEL, academic achievement, and equity. So can you just share a little bit about those findings? and then talk a little bit about why you see this conversation as being so vital.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Natalie, Lakeisha, Dr. Lee, I'm deeply honored, humbled to be able to be here today and be invited to be in dialogue with you all. I thought I would take just a couple of minutes to briefly introduce my team and my lab. We're the Education Collaboratory at the Yale Child Study Center. And we believe that the future of equitable and inclusive education can be realized through innovative practices that advance the science of learning and social and emotional development. You can access information about our lab at that QR code on the screen, as well as in the resources that come through the PDF. Next slide, please. At our lab, we have three main lines of work. The first is the centering of marginalized students and educators in their experiences of social and emotional learning. And so when I use the term marginalized, I'm speaking at the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability. So really the experiences of how the identity is salient and centered in our social and emotional interactions, and both how we are able to and have the opportunity to access and benefit from social and emotional learning. The second line of work, oh, you could stay right on that slide. That's great, thank you. The second line of work is advancing the science and practice of evidence synthesis. So what is evidence? Whose funds of knowledge is it upholding? What are the operational definitions of social and emotional learning? And how we can keep up with a field that's continuing to evolve in its variability of what we consider to be social emotional processes and the ways in which we have the opportunity to evaluate them. And lastly, the third line of work is evolving assessment methodologies within SEL. And for anyone who's been involved in educational assessment, we know that the words assessment and social emotional learning sometimes have a pretty negative connotation when we think about the interests and experiences of students who are particularly racially, ethnically marginalized in their school community. And so our lab works with and learns with educators and students across the country to help schools to tell their SEL implementation journeys through novel assessment builds at the student, teacher, classroom, and school level. And as we go through dialogue today, I may bring up some of those assessments because everything that we do is actually free and publicly available. You can go to the next slide to just quickly note that we're working with folks all over, and I am very proud to have the opportunity to learn with the diversity of student and educator experiences nationwide. But something that our lab is unapologetically committed to is open science practices, and everything that we do in our science is free and publicly available. And so anything you hear me mention today, and I'm going to be dropping some drives into the links or follow-up questions, all we want to do is help to support and transmit science into practice in front of paywalls. And so you'll see our work coming up in Edutopia articles and K-12 Dive, up on Pinterest, and other places that educators and administrators frequent, so that we're being effective communicators and kind of meeting the need where it is. You can go ahead and move down to the next slide. So Natalie started us off with really talking about this idea of social emotional learning and how we have some varying definitions there within. And the operational definition that we work from in our science is an interrelated set of cognitive, affective, behavioral skills and strategies that underscore your capacity to learn. SEL is not a program or the program or that program or necessarily any program at all. In many cases, it's actually the process, the learning conditions that allow you to be, well, we talk about, most optimal human. So let's go ahead and down to that next slide. Despite, in part due to its interdisciplinary origins, in part due to its quick uptake, the operational definition of social emotional learning has been garnering significant discussion and conversation since its inception, and really came onto the field thanks to our colleagues at CASEL, the Collaborative Academic Social Emotional Learning, just about 30 years ago. You can click the next slide. I think an animation will appear. There you go. And so lots of key questions over the better course of the past 3 decades have included, like, which skills or all skills or some skills, how are they to be implemented? Is there a particular order that's more beneficial? When should it be included in a child's school day? Is it early and often or across time or just for a particular age band? Our social emotional learning, our social emotional learning approaches culturally responsive and sustainable, and do they promote the conditions for educational equity? Next slide, please. And so with that, I want to just introduce to you, and perhaps you've heard, our lab's edit on the whole child model. And Natalie started to bring this up a bit earlier in her intro. You know, there's this idea that to educate the whole child, whole being cognitive, physical, social, emotional, and behavioral needs, that we need to start with social emotional learning. And no one's really kind of finding that to be contentious. However, our research over the better part of the past 2 decades has found that all children at the intersections of identity of race, class, gender, sexuality, language, culture, and ability have not been fully benefiting and having the opportunity to access social emotional learning. And so our work really started in that centering of all students' experience in understanding and unpacking these whole child models. You can go ahead and move to the next slide, and you can click that one more time again, and maybe a second time. We know that emotions matter, but identity does indeed matter too. And the science of emotion, it sits in the politics of our education system that advances overlapping and interdependent systems of advantage or disadvantage for some students early and often across their school experiences at the intersections of their identities, right? And so with that in mind, we have to consider, you know, 2 truths. And I look forward to having some dialogue about this with my colleagues later. The first is that students vary, right? Students vary at these intersections. And secondly, how we respond to students vary. So when we think about the intersection of identity and equity within social and emotional learning, we need to be mindful that there is no one right way to feel, nor is there any right way to regulate that emotion. And when we think about emotion in the learning context, we can be mindful of the ways in which students show up as their whole selves in their emotional expression and regulatory strategies and skills that are most attuned to their needs, their interests, and their learning, and how we as adults in our role of helping to support students to benefit in that regard through our validation and affirming of the ways in which they are expressing. In an ideal scenario, to me, social emotional learning will allow teachers to support in seeing their students as they are, not who we may imagine they might be. And we talk about that quite a bit in our assessment work. I realize I'm going long, so I'm going to go really quick through this. I'm just going to say that many of you on this line may have heard of Durlach's seminal paper in 2011 that's been most cited in social emotional learning as the why we need to invest in SEL, particularly towards its benefit of 11 percentile points in academic achievement. I want to draw your attention to that this seminal paper only included studies through the end of 2007. And I won't ask how old you were then, but we all know we were talking about a very different world, very different in the public education space, in the social emotional learning space, in the ways in which we understand educational research, implement practices, and its ed tech intersections there within. Next slide, please. And I'm going to move us through, you know, you can't have evidence-based practice without evidence, and we should really do something. So we're going to go ahead and keep going all the way through there. And anyone who knows me professionally knows that when I say, you know, we should do something about this, we do all of it, right? We make all the friends, all the partners. We're going to grow and learn and build our pathway forward together. Next slide, please. So we did a registered report of the state of evidence of social emotional learning to actually update and evolve the evidence base to really understand who and how is benefiting. And so over 240 programs, over 500,000 students, K-12, 53 countries, and 13 years of evidence. You can go ahead to the next slide. And here's just some overall findings of what we found. At the 3-level hierarchical model, those numbers on the top, the 0.194 with the 3 asterisks, that means that SEL supports all students to thrive in school. And why is this so important? That means that when you put into the statistical model everything that's going on right now in schools worldwide in the evidence base around social emotional learning, we find an overall effect. It means it's not when we're just putting in one type of program or approach, it means we're putting them all in. And we also found it across 9 of 12 dimensions. In summary, students who participate in SEL are doing better in school. We found that affected academic achievement as well as we call them their engagement behaviors, homework completion, attendance, and their SEL skills and attitudes. Next slide, please. We also found that students who participate in SEL have healthier behaviors at school, so increased pro-social skills, civic attitudes and behaviors, and a reduction in aggression and bullying. Next slide, please. We also found that students who participated in social emotional learning felt better, so reductions in anxiety, stress, depressive symptoms, suicidality. One may argue that perhaps in the United States there is no more important finding than that currently. And lastly, that students who participate in SEL programs feel safer at school. So connected, belonging, increased in school climate, had better relationships. We'll be talking about that today with trusted adults in their schools and with their peers as well. That's all in our child development paper that's in the drive. I'll be dropping on the QR code and publicly available. But I do want to note that we have a follow-up paper that's coming out soon that's actually cited in that report that Lakeisha will be talking about next, that disentangles the effects of explicit SEL instruction on student literacy and math achievement. And what we find is that explicit social emotional learning does increase students' literacy and math achievement in both their grade point averages and their test scores. And so depending upon what angle we're approaching and kind of thinking about what our opportunities are and the needs for investment in social emotional learning, the evidence is clear. We have overwhelming evidence to the positive effects and benefits on academic achievement of contemporary social emotional learning. And then with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Lakeisha.
Chris, that was awesome. Thank you. I'm here like taking notes while people were talking, and the things that I just grabbed from what Chris shared was lifting up that not everyone has access to the benefits of these integrated approaches. And I loved this idea of embracing human variation as an act of equity. I thought that was really awesome. So thank you for that. Chris, as you pointed out, we're going to go to Lakeisha next. So Lakeisha, CASEL has this very long track record, right, for building the field of social and emotional learning through research, through state and federal policy, through your capacity building supports for state and local system leaders. And I am sure everyone on the call is familiar with CASEL's work in some way. So for your introductory comments, can you tell us a little bit about CASEL's work? And in particular, how you see SEL connecting to academic learning and literacy in particular?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm so grateful to Ralph Smith and the entire team at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for having this important webinar and for having me today. I have to say that it is pretty extraordinary to come after the Dr. Chris Cipriano, who is really continuing to lead the field. And we're so grateful for her, the incredible work that she has done, and particularly the 2023 updated study on the meta-analyses. And so a deep, deep honor to be on the panel with Dr. Chris Cipriano to come after her. And so at CASEL, so the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, we're actually in our 30th year. And so for the past 30 years, what we have been doing is really working to enhance student experience and outcomes in education by integrating evidence-based social and emotional learning. We do this, as you mentioned, Natalie, and you mentioned Dr. Cipriano. We work to drive research. We work to guide practice to support high-quality implementation of social emotional learning in schools. My team, we work to inform policy so that we can ensure that social emotional learning is an integral part of a public education. And we also convene our state and district networks to ensure supports to our states and districts as they work to support student social and emotional learning. Next slide. And I'm sure for all of you on the call who are familiar with CASEL, you are familiar with our social emotional learning framework. This is the CASEL wheel. What you see inside of the wheel is our 5 core competencies. Outside of the wheel are the key environments where our students live and learn. And we know, based on the masterclass that you all just received from Dr. Cipriano, we know that SEL is most effective when it is integrated in instruction. You heard her mention explicit instruction actually improves students' reading and math. We also know that SEL has to be integrated into a school-wide culture and their practices and policies. It's central to authentic partnerships in schools to support student and teacher relationships and to create caring and foster belonging in schools. And it's also critical to ensure that we're aligning our learning opportunities with social emotional learning. Next slide. And so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you just heard Dr. Cipriano say decades and decades of research has shown that students who have access to social emotional learning see improved academic achievement, improved mental health, they have lower distress, lower anxiety, they have better opportunities to better learn social emotional skill development, and they also have better perceptions on school climate, they have a better sense of belonging, and they also feel safe And the next slide is Dr. Cipriano's updated 2023 study, where we see, as you heard Dr. Cipriano say, that our students who have access to social emotional learning, they do better in school, they have healthier behaviors, they feel better, and they feel safe in our school. And we also know that social emotional learning is also integral to all of our adults in the building, and teachers benefit as well. Next slide. We also are guided back by the widespread support that we see for social emotional learning. We know that 93% of parents say that they support social emotional learning in schools. We know that 83% of teachers say that SEL improves academics. We also know that critical student voice, 75% of high schoolers say that SEL would help them personally. And we also know that 92% of employers see SEL skills as employability skills as central to supporting students as they're integrating into the workforce. And so this brings me to our social emotional learning and literacy initiative. What we really wanted to do was bring literacy to the forefront. As you've heard today, there is an inextricable link between social emotional learning and academics, and all of these positive benefits that social emotional learning provides to students' academic achievement. And so we really wanted to explore that as we were looking and we continue to see all of the issues that our education system is currently grappling with. One around this issue of this literacy crisis, looking at our NAEP scores, where we found that 32% of fourth graders were proficient in reading in 2022, and seeing that there is more that we can do to actually support students' literacy development. And so what we set out to do was really explore the role of social emotional learning and supporting students' literacy development. And so we've been working with two of our country's most salient researchers. So grateful to Dr. Carol Lee, who's completely iconic. I'm sure you all are familiar with her work, but you'll get to hear from her soon. She's one of the researchers that we're working with, and Dr. Alessandra Ward from Wheaton College. And Dr. Lee actually brought us together with researchers across the fields of human development, learning sciences, as well as neuroscience, in a white paper to look at this integrated approach to supporting students' literacy development. In this white paper, we really call on policymakers to look at the full breadth of literacy research to better support literacy development and rigorous instruction. When we looked at how important this integrated approach is to building students' foundational reading skills, so that in our schools, we'll see a focus on comprehension, we'll see a focus on language, we'll see a focus around knowledge, as well as social emotional learning. And so in this white paper, you will see that we provide policy recommendations that look at strategies to do exactly that, really supporting literacy development of all students and really lifting up the importance of that integrated approach of really bridging the science of reading with the science of learning and development. And we include a number of policy recommendations for policymakers to really look at extending that scope of the science of reading, to really integrate the science of learning and development, better supporting our teacher professional learning and development, and really strengthening our education research so that we have this integrated approach to understanding what more we can do to actually support literacy development and that rigorous instruction. This week, we also have the first in our series, The Role of SEL in Improving Literacy Development. It's an introductory brief, and we're really excited about what Dr. Lee and Dr. Alessandra Ward have done in this brief, really, which is articulate this framework for how social emotional learning can support literacy development, specifically looking at the 5 core competencies and how those 5 core competencies can support literacy development, which we know is central to civic engagement and civic discourse in our country. So we look forward to this work in this series that we hope will inform the field, but also better improve our infrastructure to better support literacy development in our country. As you all know, literacy and social emotional learning, there has been this dichotomy in our education system where we see learning and social emotional learning as separate. And so here we have this initiative that really propels how integral the science of the social emotional learning and literacy and how inextricably linked they are, and how if we actually harness all of the full breadth of research, we can better inform instruction, better prepare teachers going into the classrooms, and best serve our students to ensure that our students are actually graduating, and they are graduating to a world where they are successful and they have a full command of reading and literacy to serve them well for over the course of their lives. And I will go ahead and turn it back over to you, Natalie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lakeisha. Okay, Carol, we are thrilled to hear from you next. I know you have so much like wealth of knowledge and wisdom to share with us about this. And so the question that I have for you, but please feel free to broaden it if there's more that you want to share, is about what the data shows about literacy in the United States and how taking a comprehensive approach that integrates and includes social and emotional well-being and social SEL can actually promote higher levels of literacy and language learning. Thank you. Take it away.
Oh, great. Thank you. So I'm again honored to be here and honor the work, of this organization, and certainly to follow the breadth of research findings from the prior two presentations. So you can pull up my slides. So what I'm going to try to do briefly is to share findings from the scientific community about the essential role that social and emotional well-being and functioning play in our development. And drawing here, the science of human learning and development, at this point, it's important that we're synthesizing work coming from human development, learning sciences, various fields of psychology, and perhaps most important, from the neurosciences. Next slide. So among the big convergent ideas that have come from this synthetic work across these disciplines is the idea that human development unfolds through dynamic relationships among individual genetics, biological processes inherited from our evolution as a species, and people's participation in cultural practices. I raise and emphasize that there is a biological foundation to the arguments that are being made around social emotional development and processes, that that we have genetic dispositions, which I'll talk about briefly, that focus on the salience of social relationships and emotions and senses of well-being. This biological argument is sometimes challenging because there has been such a long history of using biological explanations to support sort of deficit ascriptions to human communities. But this earlier kind of work was really a pseudoscience, but we've got a strong basis of saying that the attention to these dimensions of human learning, our development, are essential to us, that we are social animals. We are animals, and we are social animals who run in packs in which relationships are going to be essential. The second big idea, big idea, the human brain is malleable based on experiences across the life course. This understanding of the malleability of the brain is really, really important around how we think about issues of equity. We have had a tendency in education to presume that some set of circumstances sort of preclude children or people's abilities to continue to learn. The brain is malleable across the life course. That this complex system of human learning and development privileges relationships, positive attachment with others, and a sense of self-efficacy. We know, for example, that when human infants are born, they pay more attention to human faces than they do objects. Why? Because as a species, we understand that it is built into our genetics, if you will, that attachments with other people, relationships with other human beings, and for that matter, with the natural world, are going to be essential. Human babies are are born very fragile. They take a long time to fully develop, and that development is highly, highly dependent on the nature of relationships with others. That our meaning-making processes are filtered through the perceptions of ourself, our perceptions of others, perceptions of tasks and settings, and the emotional salience that we attribute to experience. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. And finally, the human learning and development unfold through people's participation in activity within and across spaces. That means that is occurring not only in school, but in families, in peer social networks, etc. That within and across time. So how we experience our participation in whatever the set of practices are in the moment are going to matter. When we experience them in terms of where we are in the life course. So that I always use the example, my mother was born in 1920 in the midst of the Great Depression. She always had cash hidden in drawers and books and all kinds of places. Why? Because of the historical moment in which she was developing. When in cultural historical time activity takes place, etc. Next slide. So these perceptions matter along multiple dimensions. And this is very important as we think about the issue of cultural membership and issues around identity, that we have perceptions of ourselves as individuals as well as members of groups. So I have three adult children. They're all in their 40s, close to 50 now, but they're all 2 years apart. They grew up in the family, same set of sort of family traditions, cultural practices and the like, and yet they are very different individuals. So that in the process of thinking about how we attend to social emotional needs of young people, in the case of the work we're talking about, certainly the individual matters, but also the self as a member of what are likely an array of cultural communities. This has to do with perceptions of the self and the perceptions that others have relative to constructs around race, around ethnicity, around being members of extended and immediate family members, around gender, etc. So the perception of the self in terms of being a member of cultural communities of practice is very important to understand the nuances and complexity of that. And perceptions of the goals to be addressed. Why should I be, attending to whatever I'm being asked to do in this particular setting? And what do I think that entails? Next slide. So among the important drivers of our engagement, our goal setting, our persistence in activities are one, our perceptions of the way in which our needs are being met on the one hand, and that our perception of the ways in which our needs are being met, again, are very much driven by our emotions. We have a very fundamental, primal disposition, if you will, in terms of how our brain operates in terms of perceptions of threat, the perceptions of not being safe in whatever set of conditions we're experiencing. Next slide. And all I'm trying to do basically in this slide is to try to situate the propositions that we're arguing about the importance of social attachments and perceptions and emotional experiences are the ways in which these are deeply driven by our evolution as a species. So again, we have evolved as a species, as in human, in terms of human dispositions, that relationships with others and perceptions of ourselves and perceptions of our environments are going to matter. These dispositions are in fact informed and very much driven by our physiological system. It's very important to recognize that we live in a physical body and we experience the world through this physical body, that we learn and development through our engagement in cultural practices. There's been a period of time in which attention to in this case, say children, adolescents, participation in cultural practices has been viewed as some sort of add-on, sort of thing you do if you're kind of like progressive, but we in fact learn through our participation in cultural practices. And again, as has been stated by my colleagues, the nature of how environments are structured in terms of the sensory experience, the cognitive demands of those, and the issue of the human body. I think both Dr. Cipriano and Lakeisha Steele have talked about issues having to do with health, for example, that are going to be important to social emotional well-being. Next slide. So this is just, again, a kind of overview of the importance of how thinking, feeling, and perceiving are all intertwined. Natalie talked about this as sort of an integrated thread with that the image of the of the braid, that that cognition and emotions and perceptions do not operate separately. They are always in dialogue with one another. Next slide. So features of robust learning environments, when we take up what are the implications of this understanding of human learning and development, are one, that robust learning environments are going to position the learner as competent. We are not drawn to be engaged in activities that we feel we're not competent in, that they anticipate sources of vulnerability. This means understanding the whole child's, sort of context, etc., in terms of what are potential sources of vulnerability, understanding what is it that learners bring, that the brain is very much organized around building from prior knowledge. And so prior knowledge, prior experiences in the world are going to be essential to robust learning. Making public the social good and utility. So around the literacy practices, why are we reading these texts? Why are we engaged in these practices? Why are we thinking about language in the way that we are? Making problem solving explicit in public. And I think in the next section of our discussion, we'll be able to address this more, but there are some very specific aspects about problem solving in relationship to literacy that are really important, and how we make those explicit in public. Nope, go back. Well, go ahead, that's fine. So want to just conclude with some illustrations of how these multiple dimensions, social emotional dimensions, cognitive dimensions, intertwine, are connected to what we understand about the processes of reading comprehension, since our concern is on reading. So among these fundamental shifts is the understanding that reading is a relational skill. That is, relationships between the reader and the text matter for engagement and persistence. That the progressions of difficulty across grades are not based on simple readability formulas. Excuse me, and that is that difficulty, and this is interesting in relationship to this group around the notion of grade level reading, which is complex, and we can talk about in more detail later. But what changes across the grade are the demands of text change, the demands of task change. And as we get into the upper grades, reading in the disciplines becomes much more important, so that we need to be able to teach generic strategies, discipline-specific strategies, domain knowledge, and dispositions of inquiry. What does it mean to engage in reading literature as opposed to sort of reading in historical texts? That there's social and emotional demands to engaging in literacy practices. For example, we're wrestling with uncertainty and complexity, wrestling with competing demands, perceptions of the self, etc. All of which, for me, are very much connecting the notion of attention to social and emotional development with literacy. And this is very different than simply thinking that you can have a class at the end of the school day focusing on social and emotional development, as opposed to it being fundamentally integrated into the organization of class instruction. And I believe this is the final one, that the cognitive demands are very important because they can involve uncertainty. And I always argue that reading comprehension is like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle where you are not quite clear on the patterns, that you're noting and how you're putting these pieces together. It's that you're having to figure that out sort of as you go. So, testing hypotheses about how you think you're learning, monitoring what you understanding, sort of integrating what you know with the demands of the task you have, etc. And finally, I believe this is my final slide, just as an illustration of the way, in this case, around literature. These are older kids because a lot of my work is at the high school level, but the way in which particular texts and literature invite social, emotional wrestling with questions of, who am I? How do I wrestle with challenges in my life? How do I wrestle with challenges in the world? That literature can offer very powerful opportunities to wrestle with it and therefore contribute to social and emotional well-being. I think that's the end. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carol. I don't know whether all of us are going to be on camera now, but we're heading into a little bit more of a conversational piece. I'm going to just start with one question because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A with the audience. And I see that there's a couple of questions that have come in, so now is a great time to start thinking of your questions and start adding them into the Q&A for the Q&A portion. But while we're waiting for that to happen, I want to ask our entire panel a question about, so I think the presentations have really well addressed the what and the so what. I'd love to ask you to address the now what, right? So the research is really clear, and you've shared it all with us, that a comprehensive whole person ecological approach is really important for both literacy and language learning, as well as advancing equity. So I'd love to hear from the panel, based on your own work in research, policy, and practice, what does this actually look like? So can you give our audience, whose roles are spanning the entire ecosystem of our education system, maybe one or two examples of how they can help shift policy or practice to integrate social and emotional learning and literacy? And I'll open that up to whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I can start. I think that a very important part of the work in terms of an ecological system is conceptualizing the whole ecological system. That is to say, how districts think, for example, about issues of assessment, where either at the district level, the state level, or the federal level, assessments are used for this sort of high accountability in ways that they're not used in other parts of the world, does not inspire teachers to think that they should be thinking about holistic development, but only about cognitive development as if it is, as if it is isolated. Second, that the attention to holistic development, as is the case with parents. Those of you who are parents know that there is no book that you can read that's going to tell you precisely how to support the full development of your child or children, that you have to be in a constant mode of, of self-inquiry, of trying to deeply understand that child, yourself, etc. And so I think we have to create conditions in schooling where schools become professional learning communities with supports, including supports for teachers being able to read and examine literature often that was not part of their professional training around, for example, issues around human development, child and adolescent development. And then finally, that we are in a conundrum on the technical end of this relative to literacy, and I'll say specifically relative to reading comprehension, that much of the kinds of supports that are needed to really support children in learning to become lovers of reading and deeply, committed, are simply not represented either in our assessments, in our commercial curriculum, or in our standards, including the Common Core. And so I think creating opportunities in schools for teachers to really begin to wrestle with these fundamental questions is important and not unusual in any profession.
I'm going to pick up some of the themes that Dr. Lee just brought up and kind of enrich a few points here. What I was hearing was a need for investing in like explicit instruction and training of our educators at the pre-service and in-service level of how to do this work and what are your opportunities to do so, both in like during literacy time as well as during across the school experience and early and often. So I was hearing that and I was thinking how that dovetails very well with some of the science that comes out of our research in demonstrating and showing that teachers are the most proximal and optimal facilitator of social emotional learning. The evidence has been overwhelmingly clear in this regard. Our research validated it again, that when teachers are the explicit instructors, students' scores significantly improve on their academic, social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. And so I just can't underscore the importance of investing in explicit educator training. And then to just put an equity lens on it, as we were kind of hearing across, and Dr. Lee, I could listen to you talk all day. This is such an honor to be here with you. We know that students need to be seen, to be served in their education. And we also know that students need to feel safe to have the ability to learn, the opportunity to learn in that space. And in the United States right now, students at the intersections of their identities are not always safe to learn in their school systems. And so I was thinking about and wrestling with, as you were speaking, what are our opportunities to help to support and train our education workforce and our practitioners and all of the adults that are working in the service of around our youth and our nation, so that they can attend to the emotional health and well-being concurrent with their opportunities to thrive academically. And so I want to double down on our investments in our education workforce.
Thank you, Chris. Lakeisha, I think you wanted to jump in. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Natalie. I think in the policy space, I think that there are, a few things that I think that are really critical to state and district efforts around, literacy development and rigorous instruction. I think, most states have passed some form of new curriculum laws. And when looking at those laws, you rarely see this integration of this focus around social emotional learning. Also, another avenue is states really need robust social emotional learning standards. We actually need academic standards that incorporate social emotional learning and vice versa. There are only 5 states that actually incorporate social emotional learning into their English language, into their ELA programs. And so there's more that we actually have left to do here. We also know that we need to strengthen our teacher preparation programs. Not only are our teachers not walking into our classrooms equipped to support the social emotional learning needs of students, they do not learn literacy development practices until they're actually in the field. So there's more that we actually can do to ensure that there's an integrated approach there. And I think that there is also the important point of understanding that students in our urban schools and students in our rural schools do not have access to certified reading and ELA teachers. This is something that we need to ensure that states within the Every Student Succeeds Act, it is a requirement that students have access to highly qualified and effective teachers. And so we need to ensure that our students that are high poverty, that are serving our highest needs students, actually have the supports that they need to succeed.
I'd like to add one additional dimension that complements what both Chris and Lakeisha have said. So I'm a TV addict. I was born in 1945. My dad was very smart. My mom said that he built a TV. We were the only ones on the block, so I'm addicted to TV. But there are these medical programs that come on. One used to be on, I don't think anymore, called House. But you still see them in these medical programs, which represents the field of medicine as a profession. Excuse me. And that is that these individual doctors or surgeons who are highly trained with deep expertise, when they are wrestling with a complex question, do not wrestle with it by themselves. They wrestle with it in coming together in collaboration, right? Northwestern University Hospital just did, I forget, some very special surgery nobody else had done. They had the best in the world coming together. And we need to create conditions inside of schooling in which learning collaboratively, working on problems of practice is essential to to the identity of what it means to teach. That if you go in Japan, which has a national curriculum, national assessment, national textbook, everything is defined at the national level, but they have this practice called lesson study, where the individual school groups of teachers come together to wrestle with problems. I think that there's a delicate balance as we move toward, what our standards are and, requirements for certification and all of those as sort of the technocratic elements of this ecosystem are important. But it's also very important that we don't continue to reinforce this model of teaching that we have, that teachers are just technicians to be trained to follow some script. Half the curriculum that people buy say 15 minutes, you say this, then you say that. We can't do that as parents with our own 2 children, 5 children, 10 children. Why are we expecting a script for what is essentially parenting that a teacher does in a classroom with 30 kids or 150 kids if they're in high school?
All right, thank you guys. So we have some amazing questions that are coming in, and I'm going to skip around. And if we don't get to everyone's questions, my apologies. And maybe, I don't know if there's a way for us to follow up afterward with written answers to Q&A, but we've got a broad diversity of questions. So I'm going to skip around and mix things up and keep our panelists on their toes. So, oh, I lost the one that I was going to start with. Hang on one second. Okay, I'm going to start with the last one. And I love that it's written in such a strengths-based way. How can we leverage multilingual learners' home languages, including super diverse classrooms to support SEL and literacy? So I think what's standing out for me in this question is you guys interpret it. It's a shame we can't have people come off of mute and ask their questions, but thinking about serving multilingual learners and leveraging the strengths of learning multiple languages at the same time. What does that look like to support both literacy and social and emotional learning?
So first, I would say that one of the challenges in terms of how we talk about this is all of our language implicitly implies that social emotional learning and literacy are 2 different things that we want to bring together. They're not 2 separate things. They act in tandem at the moment, and across time. And that we are among perhaps one of the only countries in the world that does not value multiple languages. Almost all other countries in the world have not only great value of multiple languages, but multiple dialects, of the same language. And that what language always involves as ways of, language involves epistemologies. So in my own earlier work in teaching about literary interpretation, that there's an epistemological dimension to the study of literature, and that is that you value figuration, you value playing with words, right? That's what draws you into rich literary texts. Children, let's say in this case, who are speakers of African-American English already value that in signifying your mama's so skinny she could do a hula hoop and a Cheerio. They already bring that disposition. And recruiting that disposition then toward the goal of this is that you're going to meet the same kind of language play, in literature. So it's both multiple languages, multiple dialects that children are going to speak. There's work on translanguaging, Marjorie Orellano's work, Guadalupe Valdez, of children, for example, who are multilingual, speaking 2 languages, where the parent only speaks the home language and the child is the one who is interpreting in any number of official and highly consequential settings, and the range of kind of knowledge that the children develop in this area. So there's a whole wide body of research of the value. I think it was maybe Guadalupe Valdez had done some work years ago of children who are multilingual, who may be reading in English, but thinking in Spanish as they're making sense. So there's a tremendous amount of work in this area.
And I would just add that when we think about emotion concepts and the intersection with language or native language or multiple languages and their intersection there within, we want to be really careful that we're not prescribing certain words and terms and ways of feeling and being and knowing that are antithetical to that student's cultural home experiences and ways in which they use their emotion concepts and words in their everyday interactions at home and in their community, and how they are validated and affirmed potentially outside of school only in those regulatory practices. And I mean, there's a plethora. We were talking about all the many different types of SEL programs, as approach, the ways in which folks are kind of doing this work, and there's so much possibility and promise there within. And we need to be very mindful of it, because certain types of practices of prescribing a particular way to feel or way to use a word, or validating or affirming only a type of word or a sector or section of word, or only a word in English, right, is not being affirmative and welcoming and inclusive of the intersections and identities there within from a multilingual standpoint. There's a lot of lovely literature that's looking at how, in thinking about and recruiting families as partners in the practice and the implementation of SEL, this is where you can get to the roots of understanding and that sociocultural processes at home, and what are those words and terms and practices, and how should those be the vernacular that is the norm in your classroom experience, rather than kind of the exception or the other, or the thing that they did on Friday during that 1 month, right? So it's a very different type of approach and style than some of those scripts, Dr. Lee, that you were kind of speaking to earlier.
I would also add, I'm sure you all are very familiar with Title III of ESEA, which supports English learners. And, this is a program, a grant program that is designed to support the professional development of our teachers to improve classroom instruction for English learners. And so there is nothing that within the law that stops states and districts, particularly districts, right, who are receiving these dollars to do this, to provide education to our students. There's nothing stopping them from creating this integrated approach. There's nothing stopping districts from purchasing an SEL program that focuses on literacy, or implementing guidance and standards from states at the district level. So just want to share that this can absolutely be done now in our classrooms.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for those rich responses. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in. Okay, so the next question is, skipping back up to the top for participants who are following along in the Q&A section. As SEL becomes a buzzword or topic in politics, how can we best push back against those who are skeptical or confused? Would sharing the data points be the best way to demonstrate the research?
I'll take this question, Natalie. So here at Castle, we have a Leading with SEL coalition, and this is a coalition of 37 national organizations that have come to in support of social and emotional learning. We know from a great deal of our message testing, but also from our conversations with policymakers, is that you have to be really clear about what social emotional learning is and what it actually looks like in schools. And you should absolutely leverage the widespread support for social emotional learning. And also, I think that it's really important to look to the Hechinger report this year. Actually came out with a study of essentially a school district in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This is a school district that, unfortunately, because of the polarization around social and emotional learning, they had implemented a number of very extreme policies that created a hostile school environment. And the parents and community actually took over the school district, and they filed a federal civil rights complaint. And so I think it's really important to one, recognize the polarization is certainly real, but there is lots of research and data points that you can use, and also storytelling and what SEL is, and what it looks like in schools, but also the recognition of the consequence to school environments, to student learning, how harmful policies are when you see this type of polarization and its impact on students.
Thank
So
you.
I would add that in addition to the wide body of empirical research, which policymakers sometimes listen to and sometimes do not listen to, that particularly this understanding that emotions and perceptions and thinking are always in dialogue with one another in the moment, is to be able to sort of illustrate it in real world settings that people can see and connect with. So I gave a distinguished lecture last year at American Educational Research Association. And part of the title of it was that my new research lens, where is it? Is my cell phone, where I am collecting, I'm watching my little grandbabies do fascinating things that nobody structured for them. And I'm capturing it in the moment to try to understand. So one of my little favorite stories, two of them, I got 9, 2 of them they were like 6 and 8, or really 5 and 7 at the time this happened. And they're playing a game. The 7-year-old, whose name means ready for battle in Spanish, I won't say it because my son will beat me up, all right, is very competitive. And her perception of the game is you win. The 6-year-old, the 5-year-old, the little boy, he's in karate competition where there are 3 people and everybody wins. And his perception of the game is we're playing for fun, not win. And when she tells him that he lost the game, he says to her, "You're not my sister anymore." Meaning that his social emotional intelligence was so sophisticated that he realized that that relationship was so intimate and important to her that the way in which he could let her know that he was not happy with what she was saying was to take that relationship away. There are so many very fascinating ways, because I think that policymakers, parents, and others need to see this in the everyday lives of the young people, in this case, with whom they interact, to see that whatever people are doing, emotions are going to play a central role. Relationships are going to play a central role as in terms of, am I going to play this game or not? Am I going to exit myself, or am I going to commit to it, right? So I think that all of our sectors need to be in the process of creating little videos, little narratives that show, yeah, this stuff sounds really complicated, right? But it's real. You can see it in real life.
All right, thank you. You guys ready for the next question? Okay. I'm gonna amend this one a little bit. So the question says, what states infuse into the curriculum? So I'm gonna amend this to say, so I'm gonna amend it so it's broader. I think this person was sort of saying what states are infusing social and emotional learning and literacy into their curriculum in these integrated ways. And what's coming up for me when I read that question is an interest in exemplars and bright spots. So if you all know of either states or districts or schools that you think are doing a really elegant and effective way of integrating these things, I'd love to hear about them.
So Natalie, I'm happy to start with, and maybe this question came up when I mentioned, there are only 5 states who integrate SEL into ELA. And so happy to share, maybe there's folks on the call who are from these states, and happy to share an exemplar of some school districts that are doing great work around this area. but the states of Colorado, Maine, Nebraska, West Virginia, Wisconsin are the states that do have these standards. Now, what that looks like in practice, right, and implementation in these states is another question, but at least they have gone as far as to actually do the work to provide the supports for school district to do that through this non-regulatory action, right? But there are schools in Boston that actually are doing a really great job with integrating social emotional learning into literacy instruction.
Thank you. Carol, Chris, do you want to chime in on that one? Or are you ready for me to move on to another one? Chris, were you coming off mute? No?
Sorry, I'm trying so hard to do the chat, the Q&A, and the conversation in real time. But I wanted to just lift up, someone dropped in the chat about the work of the Urban Assembly and their explicit instruction. And so I will say, as research partners and collaborators of mine, I could speak to that firsthand as well. So as another wonderful model of what this looks like with explicit integrated instruction.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yes, and Urban Assembly, as I understand it, is growing and expanding. So it's great to see their impact moving forward. Awesome.
I would like to add just another dimension to thinking about this, and that is there is a wide body of research, certainly in literacy, that involves the design, and I've certainly done a lot of this work, that involves the design of curriculum that integrates issues around identity development. For example, in the teaching of literature, and all of that, that once you invite young people, in this case, to interrogate texts that raise questions about how they see themselves, the kinds of challenges with which they're wrestling, you know what I mean, in life, and the opportunities of the ways in which, from my, I guess was my last slide, that powerful works of literature can facilitate thinking about this. And this relates very much to the issues we're talking about around equity and constructions of race, you know, for example. And I'm not going to take the time to go off on the whole issue around perceptions around the construct of race. But all of this kind of work that we've all seen is about integrating social and emotional development with literacy practices. And that can happen with very young children, as well as, you know, through middle school and high school.
Okay, thank you.
I could add one more kind of note on that, as Dr. Lee's got me thinking. I want to just offer kind of an alternative perspective here and thinking about the intersections with SEL and literacy instruction and what this could look like. When students are having an experience of emotion in their learning experience, we know that that is underscoring their ability to access and have the opportunity to learn. And so as educators, as facilitators, as literacy coaches, when a child is expressing any given emotion, right, our ability to recognize and understand that that emotion is sharing with us a window in of how they're having that opportunity to access and benefit is a formative assessment. It is a way to which engage. So if the child is expressing that they are bored during literature, are they bored because the level of the book that you are providing is too easy for them? Are they bored because it is culturally irrelevant to them to read this, or at least they think that it is, right? What is that level of information? Or the child is experiencing stress or anxiety, right? In the ways in which it's showing up in their body with the presentation of what's being expected of them in that learning experience. Like, what is the reason why I'm getting to that place? And so I just wanted to offer that to this, because as we think about the relational components of social emotional learning, literacy, academic achievement, development, we need to be considering that dyadic interaction and that within the school community. And it really comes back to also being able to understand, respect, value, and affirm how kids are showing up. And that is a social emotional process.
Thank you. Oh, look, a poll popped up. Thank you, Chris, so much. That was a really important addition. Sierra, do you want to chime in and mention the poll?
always a bad sign when the Zoom producer can't figure out where the unmute and turn on your camera button is. But no, yes, we encourage all of you to fill out that poll. We do still have about 5 minutes for questions, so we can keep going through there. But if you could fill out that poll, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sierra. Okay. All right, so you know what, I'm scanning through the questions and I'm struggling to pick which one. Some of them seem like very quick ones to answer and things like that. Some of them I think you've maybe addressed in your comments. So since we Sierra just gave us the 5-minute warning, maybe what we should do is just say, as you all are panelists are looking through some of the questions that are here, if you had one final idea or one final piece of information that you wanted the participants in the webinar to leave with today, what might that be? And it can be something that you've already shared, but you want to underscore, or it may be a question that you wish I asked, but I didn't.
Well, I would just say, as a closing comment, what I hope are among my big takeaways is the importance of wrestling with the idea of what we think of as dialogic relations. So thinking about actually in our brain, the different regions of our brain that are entailed in different processes are always talking to one another at the same time, right? That children's displays of deep emotions are always windows where they're trying to tell us something. And one of the challenges in terms of what it means both to be a teacher or a parent for that matter is to have a sufficient sort of knowledge base and disposition to understand what is it that that child, you know what I mean, is telling me. And then just, finally, the centrality of us creating conditions and expectations that teaching is about lifelong learning that you don't do in isolation. And at the same time, recognizing, if you will, from a policy perspective, if you will, that we still have lots of challenges that make this work difficult. For example, we don't have any assessments that would give teachers indicators of the relationships between kids' perceptions of their task and the actual teaching. We have things like tripod, which is very useful for kids' perceptions about their experiences in class or school, but we don't connect it to how they're taught, or what they learn. So we've got a lot of scientific, evidence to support everything that we're talking about, but also lots of opportunities for learning that teachers can themselves address with support.
And relatedly to that, as Dr. Lee was alluding to, we can see parents and families as partners in our practice and leverage our respective and collective expertise that we bring as the most, as families bring as most proximal providers of learning and the child's first teachers, right? And how they're having and engaging in their social, emotional, and literacy engagement in classroom, in homes, into the classroom, right? Through that engagement. And I want to double down what Dr. Lee said about how I heard you saying that this takes work. This is not easy. This is certainly not a compliance checkbox or any sort of accountability mandate. This is living through our learning and our engagement with our students, with their families, with our communities over time. And that requires an intentionality to continue to grow. And I'm encouraged and supported by all of the incredible folks who've showed up on this this time together today, and all of the thoughtful questions that are coming to the chat and comments that we are on our way there. We're moving in that direction, and very inspired to be a part of this learning community with you all as we are kind of continuing to build our way forward.
I would also add to what Dr. Lee and Dr. Cipriano shared, is that I think, our country is at a critical inflection point with the need to develop a comprehensive approach to supporting literacy development in our schools. I do not think that this is an issue that we can look away from. I think for the past 30 years, we have seen where the same learning gaps occur. And so this is a critical opportunity for us to really expand our approach to instruction and to literacy development I think we owe it to all the students in our country to really get this right. I think often about all of our students at the beginning of the pandemic who were in kindergarten or in third grade, critical junctures in their education that are central to ensuring that they have foundational skills to succeed in school. And what must be coming of our students' education where they are now, and many of them graduating into an economy without these central skills to ensure their success. So I think that the time is now. It's incumbent on our policymakers from the state, district, and local level to really reimagine what is possible when we actually can integrate and bridge the science of reading and the science of learning and the development to best support students.
Awesome. Thank
Just
you.
real 2 quick points. One is if a compliance checklist worked for parenting, life would be easy, but we all know it doesn't. And the second is that if you look at international assessments, there's Tim's piece of pearls that are given on an international perspective. We are never at the top of the list ever, right? But there are countries, PISA puts out what they call a social disparities report. And there are countries in the world where kids who are poor score high, kids who are immigrants score high, kids who are ethnic minorities score high. And we don't attempt to learn from what those countries are doing.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Carol. Just want to offer my gratitude to our panelists for being so generous with their wisdom. It's been a pleasure. There's a question in the chat that says, are there any papers or books from that the panelists have written that we can learn more from? So we'll make sure those get added to the resources at the end. And Sierra, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you. I do have to tell everyone that in having our GLR week planning calls and getting ready, I always refer to this panel as small but mighty. And I think we can all agree on that after hearing this conversation and this webinar today. I mean, I know it was a smaller panel, but the knowledge and the insights, it was just powerful to hear. So I thank all of you panelists for your willingness to join us and for all of your great wisdom. I am excited to confirm that today's discussion is just the beginning of this conversation around SEL. Today's webinar kicks off a campaign for grade level reading mini-series, which will be organized to explore and illuminate the opportunities and challenges presented by the implementation of social emotional learning in public school classrooms. And while he could not join us today, we did want to confirm that Andy Rotherham has agreed to serve as our moderator for the next webinars in the series. And for those unfamiliar with his work, Andy is a co-founder and partner at Bellwether, a national nonprofit that exists to ensure positive outcomes for systemically marginalized young people. So with all of that being said, we encourage you to stay tuned for more information about the CGLR mini-series that'll be coming this fall. And we invite you to share your list of issues and perspectives that should be included in the conversation. The chat was very popular with thoughts and comments and ideas and reactions. So please reach out if you have anything that you want to share with our team. We're always willing to hear it. And on that note, I think we have a few closing slides before I let everyone go. So GLR week, if you can believe it, is already almost over. Tomorrow is our last 3 p.m. session. That'll be focused on AI and the potential that it has for closing the gaps, as well as some emerging opportunities and challenges. And then tomorrow at 12:30 Eastern time, we'll be having a community session, Ready on Day One, Strategies and Tools to Support CGLR Community Coalitions with School Success. As Evan mentioned in the front of the webinar, that will be on the Zoom meeting format, so that will require a different registration, which that link is in the chat. And then after GLR week concludes, the CGLR team will be taking a brief break through the month of August. During that time, we'll be having some special rebroadcast sessions on our YouTube page. So we encourage you to take a look at all of those sessions, and I'll be posting the link in the chat now. Oh, looks like my boss beat me to it. But we encourage you to take a look at those and register to join us. And I believe that is all, but thank you everyone so much for your work. Thank you to our excellent panel. Natalie, thank you for your moderation. And have a great day. Thank you, everyone.